Welcome to Vantage Points. I'm Hisham Al-Maligi. Tonight I'm speaking with Shahid Buttar. Shahid is running for Congress to become a representative in the House of Representatives in the 12th Congressional District of California. He is running against Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi is finishing her second term as Speaker, and if she wins her re-election and the Democrats keep the House, as it's likely the case, she might be starting her third term as Speaker. She has been in Congress since 1987. We'll ask Shahid why is he running against her, and what is the recent allegations that a smear campaign has been concocted against him. I want to welcome Shahid to the studio. Welcome, Shahid. Thank you very much for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having me, Hissam. Shahid for your reference, or Shahid, if you will.
Shahid, very good. I mean, yes, transliteration is.
What's the difference between martyr and witness, as you know, and I, would prefer to stay alive and talk about it if I have the opportunity.
So Shahid is the witness, and Shahid is a martyr. So you want to stay alive and witness the situation.
Well, and you appreciate the distinction, right? I mean, my name is
definitely.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be with you.
No, actually, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much for joining me on short notice. So tell me the story. Why did you decide to run? Of course, we're going to talk about your history later on, but first, let's tackle this issue from the get-go. Why did you decide to run? Why did you decide to run against Nancy Pelosi?
I basically decided to run. She's been my voice in Washington for 20 years. I've been her constituent. I served 2 different stints of 5 years in Washington, D.C., leading civil rights organizations. And during that time, I thought of myself as a San Francisco resident, on leave to Washington. And so I've been her constituent for 20 years, and I've been misrepresented that entire time as an advocate for civil rights and peace and justice in the face of our nation's relentless wars, abroad as an advocate for civil liberties in the face of an authoritarian expansion of executive power over the last 20 years. I've seen her, whether it was Bush's wars or Obama's deportations or Trump's corruption, pave the road for the right wing. And I love this city too much to see it be so misrepresented. And I'll tell you a quick story. In the spring of 2018, this is when I first decided to run for the seat, there was a proposed surveillance reform in Congress that Nancy Pelosi undermined. And surveillance reform and the need to defend not just privacy, but also dissent from arbitrary government secret surveillance, that's been the issue that's the through thread of my work for the last decade. And I watched her for maybe the dozenth time throw the Fourth Amendment and the First Amendment and all of our communities under the bus. And I was in a room full of colleagues. I used to work at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And I said, well, I can't say the first word, it's not polite. I said, bleep this, bleep. This makes me want to quit my job and run against her. And one of my colleagues, I think maybe reflexively, I'm not sure, without missing a beat, he said, I'd vote for you. And then it went around the room, and it basically started rattling around in my head after that. I frankly didn't even mean it. Seriously, I was just enraged to see her yet again take the wrong position. And as I thought about these people who I frankly respect a great deal and why they might vote for me, and I looked around and I saw who, at the time, there were some candidates running in a primary to challenge the speaker, and they weren't people, frankly, in who I couldn't get excited about them. And I started talking to people, friends of mine in the community, including in political organizations that have endorsed me since, some of which have rescinded their endorsements since. I imagine we'll talk about that soon. The word got back to me that it made sense. And, the fact that she has a coalition in San Francisco that I happen to be, through no, frankly, design or stratagem, perfectly crafted to crack. I was one of the first advocates for marriage equality for LGBTQ couples in the country. And that makes me controversial in some Muslim circles. And the fact that I've been a voice as a Muslim to expand civil rights to include our gay neighbors, that's an interesting place to be. And it situates me quite well to crack parts of her coalition. I'm an Asian American in an immigrant, very Asian city. That also is very well poised to crack her coalition. There's a generational piece in terms of just being 40 years or younger in an age of, frankly, rapid transition and dire crisis, and the idea that we're being led by octogenarians is, I don't think anybody's idea of our best foot forward. And in all these different cases, having seen her represent my beloved city as a relative moderate conservative in Congress in the face of this rising authoritarianism that I think everyone else has come to see more clearly in the years since, I've gnashed my teeth too long and tired of saying I told you so. And I'd like to have an opportunity to help my city and my country step over some of the pitfalls that I see the incumbent repeatedly dragging us into.
So, Shahid, give me a chronology of what took place. Like, was there a primary already, or?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll start you in 2018 because that's the first year that I ran. So in the spring of 2018, I entered the 2018 congressional race fairly late. There was just 3 months left before the primary. It was a very crowded field. I beat all the progressives. I missed the second place finish that would have put me in the runoff by 1,000 votes. In that race, I got as many votes as my ally, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, on the opposite side of the country. And I filed early in the 2020 race to come back and finish the job. So there was a primary in March 2020. I won it alongside Nancy Pelosi. The jungle primary system in California has a top two winner system, which is to say the party affiliations don't matter. All the candidates from all the parties run against each other. And again, it was a fairly crowded primary. I think there were half a dozen candidates. Nancy Pelosi predictably took first. I took second by a relative mile. There wasn't anyone terribly close. And as the first Democrat in 33 years to face Nancy Pelosi in a November election, I'm very excited to offer San Francisco a choice for a new voice.
This is like the system in California. This is my first time to know that it's
Right.
like a nonpartisan primary. In New York and many other states, the primary is within the party. So,
Right.
like, and then you have either a Democrat, Republican, or whatever other parties, excuse me, in the general election. So in California, even the congressional elections primaries are nonpartisan. Anybody from any party or no party, independents, could run, and the top two advance to the general elections.
That's right. The jungle primary system privileges the electorate and it deprivileges parties. The
Right.
closed party system, the closed primary system, which you're describing, where each party has its own election, is very party centering.
Right.
It centers the process on the party. And here in California, recognizing that in so many different parts of the state, it's basically a one party region. If in San Francisco is not going to elect anyone other than a Democrat
Right.
to represent us in Washington. So the idea of the primary being the real election and the general election being an afterthought, the state legislature many years ago decided, that doesn't make sense. We want to have competitive general elections, and we don't want parties that have locked up particular cities to just have, their carte blanche, sort of a gateway to corruption as well, to allow parties to have that centrality in the process. So the jungle primary system privileges the electorate, and it says you get to choose. And here's the entire array of options. And the top two vote getters, they go to the runoff. It's an automatic runoff against the top two finishers. And our campaign this spring was the first time that another Democrat took second place. You might internalize that as Nancy Pelosi having slid so far to the right, as I have seen her do for 20 years, that enough space opened up on San Francisco's left that there are more of us leftists disaffected with the centrism of the incumbent than there are conservatives. And I did beat the GOP candidate by a relative mile. And it just goes to show she claims to be a lion of the liberal left nationally. She was put in office by San Francisco's Republicans in 1987, and they have kept her there ever since. And Nancy Pelosi leads the Democratic Party like a Trojan horse. And I'm very eager to liberate the party and my city's voice in Washington from the corporate co-optation of someone who claims progressive principles without standing for them, in fact.
So this is huge, and I don't think people would appreciate how big this is unless they understand how the system works, as you explained it now. So you beat Republicans, you beat Democrats, you beat independents, other parties, and you are the top contender against Nancy Pelosi, and you are a Democrat.
I'm the first Democrat she's ever faced in her career. She faced another Democrat, a gay socialist, in 1987 to win her seat. And I'm a socialist, an immigrant, Muslim, 33 years later, and I'm the first Democrat to break through and have, as it were, a shot at the local title. And I would just put it this way. I think the opportunity for the movement at a moment like this, I think a lot of people in our country are correctly disillusioned with the way it is seemingly careening off a cliff, right? There are so many compounding crises, from the pandemic to an aspiring tyrant trying to shut down an election, the assault on the post office, for instance, the goon squad in Portland and Kenosha, the brown shirt vigilante violence. We seem to be racing headlong into a fascist future. And I want to be clear here. Nancy Pelosi helped build and fund it, and I have been fighting it for 20 years. I called it fascism when I graduated from Stanford Law School in 2003, and I moved immediately to the East Coast to fight the right wing under Bush. And I organized resistance from the streets to the courts under the Bush administration. And I went back under the Obama administration, and I did it again. And I fought Obama from the left. And a lot of smug liberals told me at the time, as I talked about fascism in the context of drone strikes, in the context of the crackdown on the press, in the context of the deportation machine, in the context of his unwillingness to heed any of the concerns of the Occupy movement or the Ferguson uprising, many smug liberals laughed at me as I talked about fascism. And then we saw with the Dakota Access Pipeline, similarly, his administration dither and frankly failed to defend human rights. And I've seen bipartisan fascism for 20 years. And the reason I'm running for office is that as an immigrant, and I have enormous privilege, I've had an opportunity to study with some renowned people, and I see all too clearly what is happening. I have seen all too clearly what has happened in our country's recent past. And I have done everything humanly possible, throwing my body on the gears. I've been arrested many times. My art as an artist has been dedicated to fighting for our nation's principles. My work as an advocate, my nights and weekends as an organizer. All I do is, frankly, defend this country, frankly, from ourselves. And I've seen the leader of the supposed opposition party pave the way to authoritarianism while representing our nation's proudly most progressive city. And I'm not okay with that. And the very same principles that brought my family here, migrating halfway around the world twice for the opportunity to experience liberty and opportunity, I'm not willing to let those values slip through our fingers. And unfortunately, the entire generation of incumbents before us, I don't think they understand those principles enough to defend them. They all swear oaths of office to defend the Republic and the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and then they extend the surveillance powers available to an aspiring tyrant. And they give him more money for his military than has ever been given to an executive ever in the history of our species. $750 billion for weapons in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, just tell me what sense this makes. It is absolutely senseless. While hundreds of thousands of Americans are dying because we can't get health care and because there aren't enough masks to give to the nurses. I mean, it is shameful, the state in which our republic finds itself. And it is entirely a bipartisan phenomenon. I mean, that gets back to your original question, why I'm running, but please.
Definitely. So there is so much I want to discuss with you that you already mentioned, for example, socialist, and that she paved the way for the right wing, Nancy Pelosi, and so many other things. But let me start by this. My political leaning is not really right or left. And I'm kind of surprised that you said that you're a socialist, because I remember when we first met 10 or more years ago, you were one of these stalwarts fighting for the rights of the people and restoring constitutional rights and the Bill of Rights, First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, and the whole spiel. So let's go back.
Well, why does that surprise you then that I would be a socialist, given that? That seems entirely consistent to me.
Well, I mean, I was in 2010, when 2 years into the Obama presidency, first term, I realized It is not the party of the president. It is not the color of the president. It is not the gender of the president, but it's the system, including the institution of the presidency and how one becomes the nominee of either side of the ruling cabal.
There you go. There's something there, certainly.
Right. And before then, during the campaign, starting from 2006, for the campaign for the 2008 elections, I was, of course, under the spell, for lack of a better term, of Obama, African American, Harvard Law, what's his title? He was writing in the Law Review, the Harvard Law Review, constitutional scholar, African American, this and so well spoken, and as Joe Biden said about him, then he's clean. Whatever that means. So
don't get me started on Joe Biden, please.
Right.
I will say, to your own defense with Obama, you weren't alone. Plenty of people drank the Kool-Aid. I canvassed for him. I contributed to his campaign. I've said often, President Obama, when he was candidate Obama, before he became the president, he said, for me, what was one of the most insightful things I heard in politics, he was the first presidential candidate I'd ever heard. Jesse Jackson certainly did this too, but I didn't grip it at the time. I was too young to really get it. But when Obama talked in DC, I heard him speak in maybe 2007, and he spoke about change coming from the grassroots. Right. And he talked about ultimately his irrelevance as a politician. And the whole point of his getting in office was so that we could push him. And I was like, yeah, that's right. I'm a grassroots organizer. That's exactly right. And if he's offering himself up there for us to push him, that's exactly the kind of person I want in office. And then he went in office, and we tried to push him, and he didn't show up. We did push him. We camped out in public squares all over the entire country. There were thousands of us. An entire generation got shafted in a financial crisis that he inherited, and he basically kicked that generation out the front door in order to throw his lot in with the banks. And I was so disappointed with that. And then for me, the particular, I don't want to say nail in the coffin, that's a little gruesome, but just to see his administration's legacy get sealed was his response to the Snowden revelations.
Right.
I've been working since 2005 on issues including mass surveillance, and particularly focused on it since 2008. When Snowden came forward, a lot of us were like, thank God, this is what we've been saying for years. It was frankly even worse than we knew. And Congress did basically nothing about it.
Right.
And it's poignant to have this conversation today because an appellate court just ruled this very afternoon that the mass surveillance regime by the NSA is unconstitutional.
Right.
And it even name checked and dropped and thanked Edward Snowden for his service to the Republic. This is someone who the incumbent, my opponent in the general election, Nancy Pelosi, derided as a villain. And he's living in international exile because there is not a member of Congress who understands the oath of office sufficiently to read into the congressional record his revelations. That's what Mike Gravel did, so that we would all learn the secret history of the Vietnam War. That it took a member of Congress standing up like that. No one did that.
Former senator from Alaska. That's
right. He's one of the people who've endorsed me. I'm very proud of that endorsement, and his legacy is one I very much aspire to continue. It is the reason I'm running ultimately for Congress.
So did you say a second ago that the court thanked Snowden or?
That's right. This very afternoon. There was
Which court is that?
It was an ACLU case, I think, in the DC circuit. I need to read the opinion. I frankly haven't had. I've been doing interviews today, so I haven't had a chance to read the case myself. Right. I've just seen the headline.
This is a federal court, an appellate court.
At a federal appellate court, so one layer down from the Supreme Court. There's a network of federal appeals courts, the circuit courts. And I'm not sure from which circuit this came. Again, I really haven't dug in yet. It just happened a few hours ago.
A federal judge ruled that the NSA spying is unconstitutional and thanked Edward Snowden for his service.
Not just one judge. It was a majority of a 3-judge panel at least. And so, yeah, this is a big deal.
This is huge.
Absolutely. It's been years coming. And his revelations were years coming. Now, just to be clear, the decision by the appellate court, I have very little faith that it will stand on appeal.
Right.
Because the Supreme Court looms at the top of this. Mm-hmm. And people might think a lot of things, if I may just riff on the Supreme Court for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
People know the Supreme Court as a lot of things. They might know it as the body that Brett Kavanaugh just joined. And it is absolutely a right-wing institution off the rails for a generation. And you will see cases occasionally where it won't necessarily reveal its hand. And one reason for that is what I would describe as the jurisprudential thoughtfulness of Chief Justice John Roberts, who frankly doesn't play his hand, his ideological hand, much. If anything, he's often playing an institutional hand to try to diminish the politicization of the institution, almost trying to run a smokescreen so that we don't realize what the court is poised to do. If we don't rein in the Supreme Court, it is almost the guarantee that fascism will descend. The framers of the Constitution envisioned the court as the crux. It is the defender of liberty, the principles in the Constitution, the laws that Congress passes. The courts are supposed to be the body that we can go to when our rights are violated. But when tyranny falls and the courts are co-opted, there is no recourse. Our system doesn't accommodate what to do for individual rights, like the right to trial or the right to evidence that proves your innocence or the right to anything, frankly. Our rights are only as good as our courts. And think about who's at the top of our courts at the moment.
It's the last bastion of defense, and it's been veering right for a few decades. So
if I may, though, I want to get to, there's a point I want to make here. There's a proposal at the end of this. So I saw when Chief Justice, let's skip that rabbit. A lot of people have said in the wake of Justice Kavanaugh's appointment to the bench that we should add justices to the bench, the way that President Roosevelt suggested during the New Deal. There was something like a 20-year period during which the Supreme Court intervened to block the New Deal from being implemented on constitutional grounds, claiming that the government couldn't engage in the redistribution of resources as a constitutional principle beyond the reach of Congress. And eventually that was repudiated. Why am I telling you about the Lochner era? Right, because this role of a conservative court and how it can limit what Congress can do is very crucial, because we're now contemplating a Green New Deal with a conservative court looming in the background, poised to strike down parts of the Green New Deal legislation. I see this part of the institutional future. And the way I want to get around it is not by packing the courts, which is a very inelegant solution. It would subvert one bias and trade it for another. I want to stagger terms for Supreme Court justices, ending life tenure for federal judges and introducing 18-year terms. It's a legislative proposal, would not require a constitutional amendment. I haven't heard many people talk about it. It has profound implications, particularly at a time like this. I just wanted to get that out there. Thanks, Hisham.
No, thank you. Definitely, it's a very important point. So if I may go back to the term socialist, the work that you've been doing for the past couple of decades in the Constitution and the rights, put you more towards the libertarian philosophy. Forget about the practice of many libertarians, but the libertarian philosophy and the forefathers, the founding documents in its intended, purpose.
I disagree, but I hear you. I can see where you're coming from.
Okay.
And this is a great conversation to have, actually. This is like very meaty in terms of political theory, because it begs the question, where do our rights come from and who is defending them?
Right.
You're particularly right during the Obama years, when circumstantially, because it was a Democrat leading a center-right administration, advancing authoritarian powers from biometric surveillance to indefinite detention without trial to drone strikes, arbitrarily killing even American citizens and their children based on speech. Yes, that happened. And, mass incarceration, arbitrary police murders, I could go on. In the face of that program being led by a Democratic president, the resistance to it predictably came from libertarian corners, which is why in that era of my work, there were certainly a lot of libertarians supporting me. But I don't come at these issues in any way from a libertarian perspective. I come at these issues from a post-colonial, revolutionary, people-centered socialist perspective. The kind of post-colonial liberatory praxis that I am dedicated to centers our communities. And the question in my mind, whether it's in the context of resource distribution, which is probably where you're thinking of my socialism, or in the context of our rights, which is where my work is particularly focused, what serves our communities? That's my socialism. That's how I think of socialism, is what undermines institutional power and puts it in the hands of powerless people. How do we materially improve the lives of people who are struggling in the face of whatever challenges we are encountering as a society to get by? And whether that's defending our rights or whether that's expanding our rights to include housing and food and healthcare. I think of that as one project. And I can see how it would appear differently at different moments in time. But from my standpoint, my defense of our civil liberties is absolutely integral to my conception of socialism. And you might think of it as trying to keep the door open for our movement to step through and discover our aspirations and secure the consensus that healthcare and housing and food should be human rights, to secure the consensus that we shouldn't incentivize resource plunder and stealing from the future to fill the pockets of today's fossil fuel executives and investors. That these principles are ones that we will secure a consensus on, but we have to guard our democracy first and make sure that at the same time that we're fighting for our socialist future, that we can guard whatever vestiges of democracy remain. And I have seen them crumble before my very eyes over the course of my career. And I'm going to Congress to try to stop it.
I'll invite you again after the election to talk about the difference in the philosophy, because I see an overlapping between libertarianism and what you explained as far as the rights and safeguarding against the abuse of the government and overreach of the executive. But the difference would be in the economic approach.
Right.
So, but that's a different story for another time. I appreciate the intellectual component of that, and thank you for your openness to it. So
I'll look forward to that conversation. That'll be fun.
Definitely. Let's go back to the district. Tell me about the district. Is it within San Francisco entirely, or? Okay.
It is. It spans the east to west spans of San Francisco, but not the entirety of its north to south axis. So Treasure Island to the outer Richmond, down through the Sunset. There are 12 supervisorial districts in San Francisco, and 2 of them are out of the district, but the rest of the city is in. So 80% of San Francisco is the district. It doesn't extend anywhere beyond it. Oakland is out of my district. Marin is out of my district. San Mateo, Daly City, all that's out of my district. But San Francisco proper is, I live basically at the corner of Haight and Ashbury, which is a very iconic corner in our city. Synonymous with an era of its history that was proudly countercultural. That's kind of the ethos that I represent. I came here as a child of the Midwest, seeking an opportunity to learn as an artist and grow as a young lawyer in an ecosystem that was proudly revolutionary, and I found it. And one of the place where my heart really got sealed to San Francisco was the spring of my 3rd year in law school, when Bush was cooking up the invasion of Iraq. I was organizing very actively among students at Stanford, and the morning after the invasion, executing plans that we'd laid for months, 20,000 people from around the Bay Area descended on the financial district, and we laid nonviolent siege to the city. We enforced a general strike, and we held the city for 36 hours to try to pull the plug on a corporate invasion. And I saw people power. I understood what it meant. Popular sovereignty became real to me then. And that's what I've aimed to build ever since. I've always organized in the grassroots in DC, here in San Francisco, while holding down work in the nonprofit sphere as a professional advocate, challenging authoritarianism. And, I do think that there are lots of different ways to seek a brighter day and defend our communities. And again, I'm looking forward to that conversation with you about what different shapes those take in different forms.
Definitely. So we're speaking with Shahid Buttar. He's a congressional candidate. He is running against Nancy Pelosi this November 3rd. For the first time, Nancy Pelosi faces a Democrat since 1987. California's election is nonpartisan, meaning anyone from any party or independents could run in the primary, and the top 2 candidates advance to the general election. Shahid was the first Democrat to ever face Nancy Pelosi in the general election since 1987. So, Shahid, now, how do you see this race going? And tell us more about the latest issue about the smear campaign, and if you think that her campaign is connected to it in any way.
Let me start with how the race is going, and then I'll get into the controversy that's ensnared me recently. We're active all over the city. We've got thousands, tens of thousands of supporters. I've been really amazed at the breadth and depth of the support across the city. One of my favorite moments this campaign was July 4th. I was at Mission High School in the Mission, surrounded by about 5,000 activists. We were out in the Movement for Black Lives. This action was organized primarily by young Latinos and women of color, students at the high school. And it was incredible. We had a sound truck out there, so we were helping amplify some sound. They were playing salsa music. It had the air of a street festival, but very much with the consciousness of revolution. And they spoke. I was impressed by the wisdom of these very young people, reflecting in fairly timeless terms on themes including liberation and building together a brighter tomorrow. And I was so humbled to be among that crowd and to have the chance to speak to that crowd about the role, for instance, of the CIA in promoting paramilitary policing and mass incarceration, connecting the dots between the movement to defund the police and the Pentagon, doing my job basically as a public educator and seeing thousands of people respond to it in real time. Now, that's the kind of energy we've been getting on the campaign throughout. The endorsements that we had received really reflected that momentum. And this will be a good segue. I'll get into what happened just by reflecting on the endorsements that we picked up from, at one point, Democratic Socialists of America, Progressive Democrats of America, the San Francisco Tenants Union, member of the school board, Gabriela Lopez, member of the Board of Supervisors, Socialist Dean Preston. We lost every one of those endorsements while retaining the endorsements of Marianne Williamson, Senator Mike Gravel, Matt Gonzalez, a former president of our Board of Supervisors and very nearly a mayor in 2003, any number of other people, Lawrence Lessig, Medea Benjamin. So I have the support of all of my allies in the social movements that I have at different points represented. But the local progressive establishment over the last month basically abandoned our campaign, driven by a set of accusations coordinated and brought forward to the press by people who used to work for me, who I had replaced after we won the primary. So there were about 6 full-time staff over the course of about 3 months who had left our campaign. We also, in addition to them, had transitioned a number of vendors to new consulting relationships. So I'd sort of turned over the staff to a new team. The campaign accelerated dramatically as we did it. I'd brought in basically veterans of Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign, including the head of his San Francisco office, the California state deputy, data director, someone from Bernie's national fundraising team. We had a very substantial upgrade in the skill level and experience of the people on the team. Unfortunately, I think the people who had worked for me maybe had some feelings about that. They discovered someone in Washington, D.C., who many years ago had first accused me of murdering someone, and then she accused me of human trafficking, and then recently came up with this harassment claim. It was to the people who know us both. I do know my accuser. Many other people know my accuser. She accused me of having done things in social settings, and all the people in those social settings came forward to say these things never happened. They would have known if they did, and they know her, they know me. I don't act like that. And Liz, it turns out, as the story got public, many people started coming forward with their own experiences with my accuser. And it was frankly more than I had known. I knew that my accuser is not someone in whom I would have placed a great deal of credibility, but I didn't presume to know anyone else's experience. And then reading the reports, particularly by Jacqueline Thomas, have been very alarming to me about the, I don't want to punch down or, impugn my accusers. I'd invite people to explore that writing for themselves if they haven't yet. But so in addition to that, my former colleagues had used the harassment claim by my former acquaintance in DC as a way to get their concerns about my campaign strategy in the press. And at first, the story they told was one that I had a pattern of inappropriate behavior with my volunteers. And that was reported by The Intercept because it was quoting a DSA resolution that was informed by that rumor, which was ultimately debunked because the one volunteer who my colleagues had come up with a story about came forward with texts to say this never happened. In fact, my former colleagues reached out to her, apparently tried to get her to participate in what she described as a smear campaign. She said, "This is sick. I'm not going to participate in your smear campaign." So when the stories hit and then these texts came forward, I frankly felt very strongly that the truth would set me free. And we encouraged her to make her texts available to the press. She did that. And all the reporters who ran the stories accusing me of harassment, accusing me of a toxic workplace, when confronted with the evidence showing that my former staff were at the very least engaged in a coordinated effort to promote a false narrative and knew that the narrative they were spreading was false. Confronted with that evidence, none of the press reports chose to issue corrections. It took The Intercept, an investigative outlet that I have some respect for, the better part of a month to more or less rewrite its story and then its headline without issuing a correction, so no one would know about the new developments unless they went back and read a month-old news story. Just failures of press ethics throughout. The printing unvetted accusation in the first place, ignoring the evidence to the contrary. Many people locally stepped forward, people including women of color, who were very active volunteers on my campaign team and would have observed a toxic environment. And people, frankly, who were more active on the campaign than most of the staff who moved on. And certainly people who had more exposure to me in the workplace than many of my former colleagues. And the press wouldn't cover them either, nor would the local clubs. Every one of the local organizations, with one exception, without any process, presumed the accusations to be true and rescinded their support, which I could say a lot of things about. But as a brown man falsely accused, particularly as a Muslim man accused of misogyny in the workplace, I find myself perplexed because there hasn't been any fact at any point. And the only evidence is frankly suggested that these things aren't true.
Right. So I want to make sure that I understand.
Yeah.
This person who's accusing you of something is in DC. Your former staff kind of promoted her claims to the media. The media covered it. Now, colleagues who know you and know the accuser came out with their own stories of how the accuser makes up things. Is that more or less the case?
To be charitable, yes. Yeah.
Okay. And then someone
brought worse than that, but yes.
And then someone brought text messages to prove that this was a made-up thing and it was given to the media. Most media didn't change their stories, except The Intercept, which didn't issue a correction, but just changed the title, the headline, and the content without issuing a correction.
That's all accurate. That's right.
This is like unfair, to say the least. But do you feel that there is pressure from the Pelosi campaign? Do you feel anything in that regard?
Let's talk about that. Not directly. I can't claim that Nancy Pelosi's engineering this effort to promote a false narrative. I would put it this way, though. My former staff, the people who worked with me in the primary campaign, I hired them from the city's progressive establishment. One of them was a canvassing director for a former mayoral candidate. Others of them had worked on campaigns for local supervisor races. And the local progressive establishment, even though it's pro-immigrant rights and it's anti-surveillance and it's defund police, nobody in the progressive establishment here cares enough about those commitments to actually oppose Pelosi, who funds concentration camps and wars and prioritizes tax breaks for millionaires in the midst of a pandemic and opposes Medicare for all and the Green New Deal and imposes GOP austerity rules and slow-walked impeachment and then limited it. I could go on. Nancy Pelosi paves the road for the right wing. And because she's a powerful Democrat, the city's progressive establishment is cowed by her. More or less, if you want a job in the Democratic Party, not just here in San Francisco, you have to play nice with her. That's just how it goes.
Right.
And so anyone who has career aspirations is sort of under her thumb. One possibility here is that my former colleagues wanted to ingratiate themselves to that establishment. I shame the San Francisco establishment because I stand for the principles that they talk about but are unwilling to actually stand for. And that's one reason why a lot of the people who've stepped forward to support me, I want to particularly name drop and thank Gloria Berry. Gloria is an Afro-Latina grandmother, Navy veteran. She's an elected member of the Democratic Party's County Central Committee. And one of the ways we met actually was at a DCC, a DCCC meeting, where one of the members dropped the N-word half a dozen times within 30 seconds. And Gloria and I are both on our feet, shoulder to shoulder, being like, you stop doing this.
Wow.
And that sort of, and then she saw me show up in parts of the city that my former colleagues, my staff encouraged me not to go to because there aren't any votes there. And I'm going to go to Bayview and the Hunters Point. These are often overlooked African-American enclaves in San Francisco, the site of some of the worst environmental justice disasters, the Navy poisoning an entire neighborhood for decades in the country. Asthma rates and breast cancer rates in particular are among the worst in the world. Here in San Francisco, in our proud progressive bastion, and my staff's attitude, just like you would expect if a progressive establishment was, there aren't votes in those neighborhoods. Don't waste your time there. And I go there because, frankly, I don't care. It's not about if the votes are there. I go to where the issues need representation. And I frankly think that one reason the votes might not have been there in the past is because people don't go there. Also because people don't show up for the community's interests. And I'm a different kind of politician. I don't prevaricate. I'm not interested in message testing everything I say. I just speak the truth. I go where I'm needed. I pass the mic around and I do the right thing. And I know that that chafes a lot of people. And I can understand how, in the context of our campaign, I want to squarely address another thing that my former colleagues brought up because we've sort of skirted around it. After they brought this narrative about my supposed inappropriateness with volunteers and that got debunked, then they brought forward the sex harassment claim from the person in DC and that got debunked. At the same time as they were doing all that, they were claiming that there was toxic workplace environment on my team in the campaign. And I want to be really clear how seriously I take it. I'm not trying to be glib about it. I take it really, really seriously enough, frankly, that we paused a bunch of things to take a hard look and is there a problem here? And I talked to my current staff, who talked to my former staff before they joined my team, and with whom they had very frank conversations, particularly emphasizing my former team's lack of confidence in my campaign strategy. Nobody ever mentioned misogyny at that point. I had never heard anything about a toxic workplace when they worked with me. I never heard about it after they left. The first place I heard about it was in the press, alongside this accusation of harassment that they'd found and used to bring their concerns forward. As this saga has gone on, they've written multiple Medium posts, and the general thrust seems to be that they didn't like how I was running the campaign. Their allegations have included that they think I'm paid too much. They don't think I work hard enough, which I work 18-hour days every day, and I have for years. They think that I don't know my message, which I find particularly amusing because I know my message just fine. I think my supporters know my message. It is quite clear that my former staff struggled to get it. They claimed some very outrageous things. My former staff claimed publicly that they were arranging my sex life, which is not true. I had one night off a week, and many campaign managers manage the calendar of a candidate. And, when people in my life wanted to take me to dinner, or in one case, go on a camping trip, often it was my campaign manager who scheduled that. That had nothing to do with my sex life. And either to presume it seemed enough of a stretch, but then to write about it, I was alarmed seeing it. And it did to me seem to reveal that there's something other than an aggrieved employee, dealing with a bad boss. That's sort of how it was presented. It was presented in the press as employees calling out a bad boss, when ultimately these are people with careers in politics throwing an immigrant candidate under the bus by concocting a set of shifting accusations. Really, literally everything you could imagine, right? Just sort of a kitchen sink of accusation, all without any proof or evidence, in spite of evidence and witnesses to the contrary. And the local political establishment, seeing all these accusations, sort of racing to judgment, as we've seen done in any number of other cases involving particularly brown men accused by white women of sexual improprieties.
Right.
You think that in my case, it might have deeper or wider reaching effects, because as much as I was the target, I'm not the one harmed. People harmed by this kind of activity are the kids in the cages that Pelosi funded. They're the people in whichever war she and Biden are going to team up to try to bomb next. I'm running for a set of principles and to defend a whole bunch of communities. They are the ones ultimately harmed by these smears. And
so before we get general election and the Democratic Party. I want to just end with one point on this campaign staff. You replaced him after you became basically the only opponent left against Pelosi. So that's a different stage of the game. You need boots on the ground that know what they're doing. You're running a serious campaign. You want to do something positive for the district. You want to win, of course. So you just got people with more skills, with more experience. Was there anything about that changed the campaign staffers, that they weren't good, that they weren't ethical, anything like that? Or it's just basically you needed better skills and more experience?
At the time, I would have described it as more experience and maybe more alignment with my strategic vision and my theory of change.
Mm.
And the time since, I mean, I didn't have ethical concerns at the time. I certainly see ethics being challenged in any number of ways since these accusations came forward. I mean,
Right.
there have been all kinds of volunteers of mine who've been getting bullied by my former staff, some into silence. There is, when I say there's an organized campaign, there is an organized campaign. And
Right.
again, I'm not the only target. They've called people who currently work for me liars. They've accused one of them of crimes. They've, again, bullied multiple of my volunteers in public. It's been very disappointing to see the sort of scorched earth that the campaign to accuse me and end my campaign has attained. I will say that I'm very grateful for the press outlets that have paid attention to the facts enough to publish, for instance, the texts. The Humanist Report was the first to do that. And I've been told that other outlets are writing stories as well. I do appreciate ethical journalism. I think it matters a lot at a time like this, particularly when we see our most fundamental values implicated. And as the story comes out and people come to understand what went down over the last month, I'm very much looking forward to, especially in the heels of what happened to Alex Morse in Massachusetts, hoping that people learn enough from that recent history to put us in a position to offer our city a voice in Congress more aligned with our visionary values.
So, knowing what we know about the power and the position of Pelosi, it's not easy to get people to endorse you over her within the party. But you mentioned that you hired people who worked on the Bernie Sanders campaign. What about Bernie himself? What about AOC? I mean, I doubt that AOC would have the ability to do anything, but Bernie might. What's the story here?
Let's take them in sequence. So I would have thought that AOC wouldn't have had the space to endorse me, except she did just note it. I think she just endorsed someone challenging. I believe she endorsed Alex Morse. I need to check that to be clear, but she was certainly outraged when Speaker Pelosi endorsed Joe Kennedy over Ed Markey. There was a Senate race this week. Ed Markey, climate justice champion, won his reelection to the Senate. Speaker Pelosi violated her own rule in endorsing against a sitting incumbent. In making that endorsement, she not only broke her own rule, she also undermined climate justice, and she promoted dynastic family politics over our nation's proud commitment to democracy. Ocasio-Cortez, to her credit, said nobody has a right to be critical of primary challenges anymore because Pelosi's doing it right here. So I think maybe she does have the space to do it. I certainly would welcome her endorsement. We're certainly aligned on all the issues, and I'm eager to support her vision if I have the opportunity to join her in Congress. Now, Bernie's great story here. So it'll take about 90 seconds. It's worth telling. So I think it was sometime in February, I wake up to a New York Times story involving Christine Pelosi, the speaker's daughter, who sits on the Democratic National Committee, calling Bernie Sanders to complain that Susan Sarandon had endorsed me. Now, just to be clear, I don't talk to any of these people. I've never had a conversation with any of them, but they're all talking about me, and the New York Times is printing this. And I'm sitting here in my bedroom in San Francisco wondering, is this junior high or am I running for Congress? And why won't any of them just talk to me about this? Anyway, so fast forward a few weeks later, Bernie's on the debate stage against Michael Bloomberg, who Nancy Pelosi at one point warmly welcomed into the race as what she described as a positive influence. Bloomberg says, if we nominate Bernie, we, the Democrats, because he now calls himself a Democrat after having been a Republican mayor, we are going to lose the House majority, so Bloomberg claimed. Pelosi, the next day, to her credit, and reflecting some degree of political shrewdness, came out and said, no, in fact, Bloomberg was wrong. Pelosi threw Bernie a fig leaf here, saying if Bernie's the nominee, we won't lose the House majority. That was Bloomberg blustering, don't take it seriously. A week after that, Bernie is asked about me, to my knowledge, for the first and only time. Reporter in San Jose asked about our race, and he says, I'm not involved in that race. And she says, I understand that, but a lot of your supporters are, particularly the SF Berniecrats were one of the first organizations to endorse our campaign, and they still recommend it. And he says, I understand my supporters support that race, and I do not. And I at that moment felt a great deal of ambivalence, because on the one hand, I was so disappointed. I would love his support, right? I mean, he's why I got in the race. I saw Bernie do it right. Bernie, I saw as the movement candidate who walked the talk and did it for 50 years. I'm kind of like a Gen X version of him. I've only got 20 years of receipts, but I've been walking the walk from the streets to the Congress and the courts and every place in between I could get my feet through the door. Mm-hmm. So I'd love his endorsement. And I took enormous pride in recognizing the dynamic, because I basically played, I think, a fairly instrumental role in keeping Nancy Pelosi off Bernie's back. Mm-hmm. There have been any number of points this cycle where Nancy Pelosi has shown up vastly to her own left. Mm-hmm. Issues like policing, congressional war powers, saving the post office, executive accountability. I could go on. And I think of in each of these cases, there being a social movement that compelled her, using our campaign as a fulcrum, the way that a fulcrum amplifies the force on a lever. Mm. And I've seen social movements assert leverage over the speaker that we've never had before. And I think it's because she faces the first viable challenge, particularly from a Democrat, of her career, and she knows it. And I'm looking very forward to continuing to push her left until I push her out of her seat and give our city a new voice.
And for those who are not familiar with how the game of politics is played, your pressure on Pelosi by your positions, exposing or basically doing a comparison between yourself as a Democrat and herself as also a Democrat, but two wings of the same party, that in and of itself pushed her towards the left rather than towards the right. And therefore, she also laid back from pushing against Bernie's positions. Is that summarize how?
Another way to put it, I think you're on it. I would put it this way. I think she didn't want to poke a bear. And it's not me that anybody would worry about. It's not me fueling my campaign. It's us with a capital U. And she knew that if she came after Bernie, there would be not just Bernie striking back, that she would be antagonizing a base of people represented in her district by a challenger poised to remove her. Right. And I think she wanted to make sure to give Bernie no excuse to get behind me, recognizing that his support could be so frankly pivotal. And I think that basically the threat of not me, but us being activated as an anti-Pelosi force was enough to intimidate Pelosi and dissuade her from her, I think, would-be inclination to support Bloomberg, and instead offer an olive branch to Bernie. And in that exchange with the reporter, when Bernie, reiterated that he's not involved in our race, I saw him basically, claiming plausible and in fact real deniability. Susan Sarandon endorsed me, yes, and she endorsed Bernie too. But the idea that Christine Pelosi is going to call Bernie to complain about that, it's just so juvenile, right? I mean, give me a break. But that notwithstanding, I feel like Bernie saying I'm not involved in that race, I took a great deal of pride in that, because it was him basically, I was playing my role as a good lieutenant. It's not about me. It's about us. And anything I could do to create space for him. Mm-hmm. I mean, honestly, that might be one of the proudest moments in my life if I managed to keep the Speaker of the House from kicking Bernie down the stairs at a pivotal moment in the presidential race. And even if that's all I ever do, I mean, I'm proud of that. I aim to do a good deal more than that. But that to me was an indication that he recognized that I'd done my job, maybe. And I do hope to have a chance to work alongside him on the other side of Capitol Hill if I'm so fortunate.
And some campaigns' success is how they make the opponent move. It's not just by winning the elections. And this is what I learned from my own run for office, although my performance wasn't as good as yours. How did Bernie do in San Francisco?
He, I think, was 33%. And the key statistic I'd put forward here is that Bernie voters plus Liz Warren supporters were 51%. And our platform hews more closely to those presidential candidates than does Pelosi's. Pelosi's platform is kind of like Bloomberg's or Biden's, and ours is frankly Bernie, and it's a little bit left of Liz's. But the point is, Warren and Bernie voters, if they vote their principles consistently from the presidential primary to the congressional race, I will be their next representative in Washington. And the question is, how many of them fall for the ruse that Nancy Pelosi fights Trump, even when she signs all his bills and funds his goon squads and his concentration camps and his military budgets? You know, how many people will get fooled by MSNBC into disregarding the facts? And the fact of the matter is that whether it's Fox News or MSNBC, it's various forms of corporate propaganda. And really, our race is a referendum on how independent-minded is San Francisco and how, frankly, informed is the city. Nancy Pelosi hasn't debated anyone in 33 years. It's one reason why I think a debate is so crucial. And I will just say, if there's an opportunity for this city to hear the contrast between the choices before us, I have no doubt that I'll be in the next session of Congress, and I look forward to representing San Francisco.
And on that note, I want to just say that I welcome the speaker to come on the show and say her piece. And hopefully, maybe I could moderate a debate between the two of you, since I'm an outsider. I'm on the other coast.
I would love that.
Right. Thank you. Shahid, take the next 4 minutes, the last 4 minutes of tonight's episode, and talk about the Democratic Party, the 2020 general elections, and what do you see is going on within the party, the fight between the wings, and of course, the last words from you to viewers and potential supporters.
Thank you, Hisham. I would say that we are at a crossroads, and the question is, do we let our civilization get dragged into a fascist pit, or will we recover any modicum of fidelity to our own stated principles that we have written on paper, principles in many cases that we have carved in stone, the rights that we have let slip through our fingers, not to just a criminal president, but to a bipartisan edifice of paramilitary policing, mass incarceration, mass surveillance, indefinite detention, executive secrecy, predatory lending, mass homelessness, corporate health care that kicks sick people into the street, fossil fuel extraction that's kicking an entire generation off a cliff. This is not sustainable. It's not humane. It's not just, and it's not acceptable. And we have to claim a brighter future. We don't have the luxury of waiting and the deference to established power that I see corporate Democrats demonstrate and repeat. It turns my stomach because I know what's at the end of that process: climate catastrophe, misery. We can do better than that. We have to do better than that. The future needs us to take action today. And that's why I'm so grateful to be with you tonight, and why I'm so eager to invite your listeners' support. If you care about climate justice or racial justice or economic justice, I'd invite you particularly to volunteer with us. You can check out our website at shahidforchange.us. Also, shahid.fyi will take you there. Volunteering with us can take many forms. Hundreds of people are phone banking. That's a crucial way to extend our voter outreach efforts, particularly during the pandemic. The training and orientation process is very straightforward. We'd love to include anybody and any of your respective networks that want to lean into the future. We have just a few weeks left. This is a really crucial moment. And when we win this race, it will be the biggest upset in U.S. political history. And the signal it will send across Congress will be an earthquake. And it will be much more than just one vote replaced in the House. We're going to send the signal that corporate rule is over, and centrists in the Democratic Party will either show up for their communities or we will show them the door. Again, shahidforchange.us. Thank you, Hisham, for bringing me on tonight. Thank you to everybody for tuning in, and hope to have your support this November.
Thank you so much, Shahid Buttar, for joining me tonight. Shahid is running for Congress in the 12th Congressional District in California, representing San Francisco, and is the finalist in this November election against Nancy Pelosi, who held this seat since 1987. Shahid became the first Democrat to challenge Pelosi in the general election since 1987. And he is a democratic socialist and looking forward to the debates between you two. And please let me know if you have any other issues in the future that you want to come and discuss. You're always welcome. And we have our other discussions that we agreed upon.
I look forward to them. It was great to be with you tonight, Hisham.
Likewise, Shahid. Thank you so much. And this concludes our episode tonight. There are hashtags and there is a hashtag. This is the hashtag. Take care, America.